All right, everyone, we are going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone to today's Counter Narrative Project webinar through our Black Gay Vote initiative. And this particular webinar is about voter suppression. I want to thank you all very much for joining us. For more information on the Counter Narrative Project, you can visit us online at thecounternarrative.org. And if you'd like to send us an email, you can certainly send us an email at info@counternarrative.org. So welcome to today's presentation. The mission of the Counter Narrative Project is to build power among Black gay men and to work in coalition and solidarity with all movements committed to social and racial justice. Once again, I mentioned you can find us online on our website at thecounternarrative.org, but you can also follow us online at Twitter. We are at Building Desire. At Instagram, we are at The Counter Narrative, and you can certainly find us on Facebook as well, and we can be found at The Counter Narrative Project. As for guidance for today's webinar, so all participants will be on mute for the duration of the webinar, but you can interact with us. So on your screen, you should see a Q&A button. If you're joining on your phone, you might have to tap your screen to see that button. But if you're on your computer, you should see that button. Using the Q&A box, you can send us a question and we can respond to your questions. So questions can be asked throughout the presentation. I will make sure that I prompt so that folks can ask us questions. But at the end of the presentation, we will go ahead and make sure that we address some. So while you are on mute, that's okay. You can still ask questions throughout the presentation by hitting the Q&A button. Thank you. We will have two presenters today. So hi, my name is Johnny Cornegay and I am the Mobilization Director for the Counter Narrative Project. I am honored to be moderating today's conversation. We will have presentations today by Patrick Berry from the Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law. And we will also hear from Sean J. Young from ACLU of Georgia. I will tell you more about both of our presenters as we move forward in the presentation. So I first wanted to start by talking a bit about what Black Gay Vote is. So Black Gay Vote is a nonpartisan civic engagement project of the Counter Narrative Project that raises awareness and mobilizes our community around voter registration and voting. We ensure that voter rights are protected and that our community votes. In addition, we raise awareness around and fight back against voter suppression. So this presentation is a direct correlation to that particular goal for Black Gay Vote. If you are interested in Black Gay Vote, certainly send us an email at info@counternarrative.org and we can share more information for you. And if you haven't done so, join our mailing list and you can see when other events related to Black Gay Vote become available. Perfect. So we want to go ahead and talk about what is voter suppression. So numbers who might otherwise vote in a particular election. So that's kind of the formal definition of voter suppression, and that particular definition came from Ballotpedia. So if you visit ballotpedia.org, you can get more information. Types of voter suppression include voter caging or purging, phone jamming, providing false information to prevent voters from voting, voter intimidation, and illegal third-party voter registration conduct. So as we kind of move through this presentation, I wanted to ground us in what voter suppression is from a definition standpoint. And as we go through these presentations, I'm sure more questions will arise for you about voter registration, voter suppression, and we want to be sure to answer some of those today. So please feel free to use that Q&A box above, and we will make sure that we get to your question. So without further ado, I want to jump into the presentation portion of this. So I'm going to introduce our first presenter. We will first hear from Patrick Berry. Patrick is a fellow at the Brennan Center's Democracy Program, where his work focuses on voting rights, restoration, and fair, diverse, and impartial courts. He first joined the Democracy Program as an intern in conjunction with the Penn Law Legislative Clinic. Prior to joining the Brennan Center, he also served as the law clerk for the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington and open primaries. Patrick is a summa cum laude graduate of the University of Central Florida and a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, where he served as executive editor of the Journal of Law and Public Affairs. I'd like to go ahead and welcome Patrick Berry. So Patrick, you can bring yourself off of mute and go ahead and share your screen so that we can see your presentation. Hey there, Patrick. I'm not sure that we can hear you yet. I can definitely see you. There you go.
Here we go. Second try. All right. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the Brennan Center, we are a nonpartisan policy and law institute affiliated with New York University School of Law. We work on issues of democracy and justice, and we employ a multidisciplinary approach to advance our work. Today, I'm going to provide an overview of what Black voters are up against across the country, as well as opportunities that exist for promoting voting rights. It should come as no surprise that there are a lot of threats to the Black vote. However, because of time limitations, I'm only going to address the first three here on my slide. But if anyone's interested in connecting after today's webinar about the other three or just voting generally, I will have my contact information at the end of my presentation, and I'd be more than happy to speak with you. So the first threat is inadequate federal protections for voting rights. This threat stems from the United States Supreme Court decision in Shelby County versus Holder, where they invalidated a key provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which required certain states with a history of discriminatory voting practices to obtain approval from the federal government for any changes with regards to voting before putting those changes into effect. Unsurprisingly, the court's decision removing that provision of the Voting Rights Act resulted in a predictable flood of discriminatory voting rules, which has contributed to the second threat to the Black vote, which is restrictive voting laws. Between 2011 and 2019, 25 states enacted new restrictions that are currently in place. These restrictions include cutbacks to early voting, new obstacles to voter registration, and burdensome voter ID requirements. In 2018 alone, Arkansas, Indiana, Montana, New Hampshire, North Carolina, and Wisconsin enacted new restrictions. Today, these threats are still very real, This year, at least 87 bills were introduced or carried over from previous legislative sessions in 29 states, and at least 7 restrictive bills in 5 states, namely Florida, Tennessee, Arizona, Indiana, and Texas, have been signed into law or have passed through the legislature and are awaiting the governor's signature. In addition to new restrictions on the Black vote, the third threat, felony disenfranchisement laws, is a long-standing threat. Millions of Americans are denied the right to vote because of a past felony conviction, and most of those citizens are no longer incarcerated. They live in our communities, they work, they pay taxes, and they raise families, but they are still denied the opportunity to have a say in our democracy. These laws have roots in the Jim Crow era, and today they continue to operate as designed. In 2016, 7.4% of the Black voting age population was disenfranchised due to a past felony conviction. As you can see, looking at this map here I have on the screen, disenfranchisement laws vary dramatically from state to state. 2 states, which are red on the map, Iowa and Kentucky, provide for permanent disenfranchisement for everyone convicted of a felony. And then the 2 light green states on the map are Vermont and Maine, which don't have disenfranchisement at all. The other states have varied policies, and navigating this patchwork of laws causes confusion for everyone, including election officials and prospective voters about who is eligible to vote. This confusion results in de facto disenfranchisement for voters who are eligible, but think that they aren't. Despite these threats, there are also opportunities. By our count, state legislatures introduced more bills this year to expand voting than attempts to restrict it. At least 679 bills were introduced or carried over from previous legislative sessions in 46 states. And at least 34 expansive bills in 20 states have been signed into law, with additional bills likely to be signed into law. In addition to these expansive voting proposals, we've also seen momentum around rights restoration across the country. In the last 20 years, 15 states have taken some action, whether that be through legislation or executive order, to restore voting rights to individuals with past felony convictions. Last year, those states included Florida, New York, and Louisiana. And this year, 2 states, Colorado and Nevada, recently passed laws restoring voting rights to people immediately upon their release from prison. Today, there are there are bills still pending in 2 states, California and New Jersey. This year, voting rights restoration also became part of the national dialogue, with all major 2020 Democratic candidates for president taking a position on the issue. And although we are seeing progress nationally on rights restoration, it is not without pushback. In Florida, a state that I have been spending a lot of my time working, the legislature recently passed a bill that would require returning citizens to pay all outstanding financial obligations before being eligible to vote. The governor hasn't signed the bill yet. However, once it does get signed, the Brennan Center will be filing litigation with allied organizations in hopes of helping as many voters as possible to get their voting rights back. So how can you fight back if you don't work at the Brennan Center? You can, of course, vote. You can also become a poll worker, or you could join election protection, drive people to the polls, or represent voters on election day. Ultimately, it's incredibly important to be engaged. These laws that are passed, they affect every aspect of our lives. And despite all of the threats, it's important to still be engaged. If anyone has any questions about voting rights generally, I also work on fair, impartial, and diverse courts. Here is my direct telephone number at the office, in addition to my email address. I hope to hear from anyone who's interested. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. So once again, thank you so much to Patrick for that presentation. If anyone has questions that are kind of bubbling up for you, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A box, and we will make sure that we get to your questions at the end of today's webinar. I'm going to come back so you can see me while I speak. Hello. So I want to go ahead and introduce our next presenter. So our next presenter is Sean Young. Sean J. Young is the legal director of the ACLU of Georgia and is active in litigating cases involving the First Amendment, voters' rights, criminal justice, and other civil rights and civil liberties issues. Since he joined the ACLU of Georgia, the legal department has prevented 160,000 voters from being wrongfully removed from the active voter rolls and blocked discriminatory polling place closures throughout Georgia. Prior to joining the ACLU of Georgia, he was an attorney for the ACLU's Voting Rights Project at the organization's national office in New York for 4 years, litigating cases around the country, challenging discriminatory voter identification requirements, cutbacks to early voting, and same-day registration, and other attempts to make it harder to vote. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Sean J. Young to the presentation. And Sean, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. And I apologize, I did not have slides prepared. But what I'm going to do is talk briefly about what is voter suppression, which has already been covered. But I'm going to talk about a few characteristics or highlight a few characteristics about it. And then I'm just going to talk briefly about what the ACLU of Georgia has done in the last 2 years to combat voter suppression. And then lastly, I'm going to talk briefly about what you should do if you feel like your voting rights have been violated. So first, what is voter suppression? It is when the government makes it unnecessarily harder for people to vote, either in big ways or small. I'm going to highlight 3 characteristics of voter suppression. First, it does not have to be overtly racist, even though it is quite obvious often that the laws are passed for discriminatory reasons. As we all know, after the nation elected its first Black president, states kind of started tripping over themselves in passing laws to make it harder primarily for people of color to vote. But the laws on their face obviously do not say that they're doing it for discriminatory reasons. Number 2, the voter suppression does not have to be obvious or sweeping. In fact, voter suppression often happens underneath the surface, and it's what I and others like to call death by 1,000 cuts. A lot of voter suppression happens on a county by county level by poorly trained elections officials that, for instance, give incorrect instructions to voters, layers and layers of different confusing voting rules, that disenfranchise voters on an individual basis. So we're not often talking about laws that, so in addition to laws like Patrick was mentioning where they say, okay, everyone with a criminal record cannot vote, you also have just the implementation of the existing confusing rules resulting in widespread disenfranchisement on an individual basis. So it ends up feeling like you're playing whack-a-mole where you're trying to deal with each instance. Examples include polling place closures or changes. Georgia has 159 counties, and over 200 polling places have closed since the Shelby County decision in 2013. Many counties do not tell, they're not required to tell people about polling place changes until only a few weeks before they do it, and only in the local paper, even if no one is reading it. We have voter purges that can happen again with little notice or no notice at all, and people don't realize they've been removed from the rolls until it's too late, and so they have to re-register to vote. That's another example of something that, re-registering to vote, for the most part, is not hard. So re-registering is not something that takes a lot of time, but it's this kind of like, again, death by a thousand cuts, where it's something, another roadblock gets in your way, and it always disenfranchises a segment of the population, even if most people are able to overcome it. You might have complicated absentee ballot or registration requirements. The voter registration form has a lot of words on it, and while, again, the vast majority of people can register with no problem, it can trip up many other people who simply can't satisfy its or understand the requirements. The ACLU has been involved in trying to make some of that language clearer. There might be complicated absentee ballot instructions. The ACLU was able to kind of quietly lobby behind the scenes to make the absentee ballot envelopes a little easier to understand, but last November, you had absentee ballot envelopes that had 3 or 4 different blanks where you're supposed to fill things out. None of it was intuitive, and people would fill in the wrong blanks or not fill in some of the blanks at all. The font on the envelopes were in super tiny script, and many people didn't even know that you had to apply for an absentee ballot, and they just waited for one to come in the mail, and it didn't come. You also have this confusing requirement where the absentee ballot has to arrive at the elections office on election day, but some people didn't even get their absentee ballots until one business day before election day, at which point it's impossible to get your absentee ballot in on time. You also have early voting cutbacks. In Georgia, there are some state standards that the counties have to all follow, but the counties also have a tremendous amount of discretion to limit the number of early voting locations and change early voting hours. And whenever counties change those hours, people who have relied on those hours before suddenly realize they can't rely on them in the future, and by then it might be too late. The last piece I'm going to talk about voter suppression is that it's historical. It's been happening ever since Black people and people of color were given the right to vote after the Civil War. It just keeps popping up in different forms, and I'm also going to add that for the most part, none of the voter suppression laws passed since the Civil War ever explicitly on its face discriminating against people of color. But the obvious impact of all of those measures did. And we again see that to this day. I think as many of us can relate to, racism takes many forms, and it's an ever-evolving monster. So you may be able to stop racism from doing, one thing, and then it's going to find another way to do it over time. And that's kind of the sad history of voter suppression. So very briefly, what has the ACLU of Georgia done? We have been able in the last few years to fight back polling place closures in at least 3 counties, such as Fulton, a rural county named Irwin, and another rural county in Randolph that tried to close polling places in predominantly Black areas. But again, those are 3 counties. Georgia has 159, and it's very difficult to play whack-a-mole everywhere. We've also started an initiative to reopen polling places that have closed, and we're making some success, but we're not there yet. In Valdosta County, Jeff Davis County, and yes, there's a county named Jeff Davis, and Macon-Bibb County. And of course, we file lawsuits. That's kind of my job. We have filed lawsuits in the last few years that blocked an illegal voter purge of 160,000 voters. We were able to strike down a statute requiring people's signatures to match if they filed an absentee ballot. So the signature they put on the ballot had to match the signature on file, and you had non-handwriting experts making unilateral determinations of whether they matched, and if they didn't, your ballot was thrown into the trash. So we filed a lawsuit, and we were able to block that provision from going into effect, and the legislature subsequently got rid of that law. And currently, we have an ongoing lawsuit against 4 metro Atlanta counties for really botching last November's elections. We saw extremely long lines, sometimes 4 hours long, at some polling places. I think many listeners here probably know all of this. And we had polling places with not enough machines. We had not enough staff. We had absentee ballots being processed too slowly. And that was in a midterm. And in that midterm, all the elections officials, and they say this every single time this happens, they say, we didn't expect such a high turnout. Well, you know, I'm sorry, at some point you need to just expect a higher turnout. The standard should not be, let's just look at the turnout last time and assume it's going to be the same. Democracy changes, and we should be prepared for greater voter turnout. And so they cannot mess up the 2020 elections, and that's why we filed this lawsuit. Last, if you feel your voting rights have been violated, either in big ways or in small ways, you know, the easy thing I'm going to ask you to do is, you know, we have, the ACLU of Georgia has an intake form online, which you should fill out if that happens. You should feel, I'm going to put this on Johnny, you should feel free to tell Johnny, and if Johnny gets a bunch of incidents, I'm asking Johnny, he can feel free to forward them to me. But I am going to ask people to take preemptive action. And for anyone who, you know, helps with voter mobilization, I would encourage you to preach this to everyone you try to talk to get them to vote. Please, 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 please go online to the Secretary of State's website and check your registration status and your polling place location months before the election. And then check it again, and then check it again. Because 99% of the problems can be solved if someone checks their registration online, sees a problem with it, and can fix it before Georgia's absurd 30-day registration deadline. Or they might notice their polling place has changed. Or they might notice it doesn't mention a polling place at all. So many problems can be resolved well in advance. Is it fair that voters have to do this? No. But unfortunately, we got to fight for our rights. A lot of the election-related problems we get obviously are around the election season. But I just tell you, a lot of nonprofit organizations are inundated with complaints and legitimate complaints and calls about people's rights being violated. And the closer it gets to election, the harder it is to be able to respond to everyone. So again, I would just urge you and ask that you urge anyone you talk to, make a voting plan. Check your registration, check it again, check your polling place, pick a time and a date at which you're voting, make sure that time and date is available at the place that you want to vote, and then execute. A lot of people don't make those plans. They wait till the last minute, which is totally understandable. Everyone's very busy. But if you're able to catch these problems early on, that would be ideal. And that's it for me.
Wonderful. Sean, thank you so much for that valuable information. And for folks that are joining us, if questions are popping up for you, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A box. But I wanted to, I had a couple of things that came up for me throughout both of your presentations, and I wanted to have you both weigh in on this. So one of the things that we've talked a lot about, so within just the Black Gay Vote umbrella, one of the things we've done is we've had an Atlanta boards and commissions training where we were talking about how do we get, or how can folks become more engaged in their local boards and commissions. And it brings up for me just kind of the engagement in the local voting process. If both of you or one of you can talk about how important is it that folks engage at the most local level of government? How important is that to how elections are run in their community?
Hi, so if you don't mind taking that first.
Please.
So I'm really glad you asked that, because almost no voters that I've talked to realize that voting is conducted at the county level. So there are two things you can do, and this is not easy. First, attend a Board of Election meeting. You will learn so much. Go online, figure out when and where the next county Board of Election meeting is, and I think this is a good exercise for everyone to do, and then show up and see what happens. Board of Elections officials are not used to being held accountable or watched at all. Many of them treat voting like it's just another bureaucracy, and they don't treat it like the fundamental right that it is. And when they have these meetings and they don't see anyone in the audience, they think it doesn't matter because no one cares, but we do. That needs to change. A lot of groups are starting to have volunteers go to boards of election meetings regularly, take notes. They then feed information back to us. But I would just challenge folks to even find out when those are. The other thing I would challenge folks to do is find out who your county commissioner is. Very few people realize that the county commissioners are the ones who pick the Board of Election members, and they're the ones in charge of funding for elections to make sure there's enough polling places and staff. Again, I will guarantee you there's not a single county commissioner in the entire state of Georgia that has been seriously called to the mat by their voters on elections. The media right now, a lot of people were very understandably angry with the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State's in charge of overseeing elections, and the Secretary of State has a huge responsibility. However, county commissioners have been left off the hook because many people don't realize they actually have a huge role. And that was partly the reason why we sued the 4 counties, is to help shine a light on what the counties can do and what they're authorized to do under law. County commissioners have never been pressured on elections, and I encourage you to call and email your county commissioner and ask them, say that the last November's elections were completely unacceptable, and ask them what they're going to do to fix it in 2020. And I can already tell you, just from some conversations, the county commissioners always say, well, we just take whatever proposed budget the Board of Elections sends us and we just approve it. So don't look at us, it's the Board of Elections. And this is what we face as advocates. Everyone blames someone else. The Secretary of State blames the counties blame the Board of Elections, and the Board of Elections blames the Secretary of State and the county. So when you go after boards of elections, they say, oh, well, the county sets our budget. When you go after the county says, oh, well, we just adopt the budget the Board of Elections sends us. I'm not even joking, that's what they say. Wow. And so you need to go after both. Find out who your county commissioner is, which is also a good exercise anyways. And I'm just going to tell you, if you pressure your county commissioner on voting, you're probably the only person in your entire district that's doing it. And so your voice is more likely to be heard.
Thank you so much for that information, Sean. Patrick, do you have anything you'd like to add to that as well, about kind of that involvement in local elections for folks?
I completely agree, and I would just add that across the country, state and county elections and local politics have the most immediate impact on a lot of people's day-to-day lives, and so it's important to not only pay attention to what's going on at the federal level, but also the state level and the local level, along the lines of what Sean spoke about.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm really curious about this. So this is my final question. I don't know one of the things I do know is that there are different rules in states, and Patrick, you talked about this. I'm specifically referring to felony disenfranchisement, where there are some states where, once you are no longer incarcerated, your voting rights are restored, et cetera. How different I imagine that is every state different in terms of what those laws are, or is there kind of some broad consistency? I'm curious.
So I can answer that. So I'd say that there isn't a lot of consistency, other than the two extremes being, there are two states, Kentucky and Iowa, that permanently disenfranchise anyone convicted of a felony conviction. And then there are two states, Maine and Vermont, that never take voting rights away. You can look at, the Northeast. Proposals, the laws in New York and New Jersey, Connecticut, states that are, blue states, or thought of as blue states, have varying policies. You can also look at that map that I demonstrated, that I had during my presentation, just really shows that there's not really any consistency. And one proposal that's been introduced at the federal level to try to make sense of these confusing laws is called the Democracy Restoration Act, which would restore the right to vote in federal elections only for anyone convicted of a felony conviction upon their release from prison. The DRA was part of HR 1, which passed earlier this year. The companion to HR 1, is pending in the Senate, and it's unlikely it will advance. But the bill was also recently introduced as a standalone proposal in both houses. And so, that's a federal effort to try to make some sense of these varying laws.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And we have reached the end of our webinar. I want to thank Sean Young from the ACLU of Georgia and Patrick Berry from the Brennan Center for Justice for joining us this afternoon. This webinar will be available for folks to continue to watch. And if there are questions, please certainly feel free to reach out to the Counter Narrative Project at info@counternarrative.org. If you visit our website at thecounternarrative.org, you can join our mailing list and learn more information about not just our Black Gay Vote initiative, but other initiatives as well. I want to thank everyone who joined us this afternoon. And thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.